Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Top 100. This is the penultimate episode and we're just gonna jump right in. Number 20. Dungeon Travelers 2 is actually pretty basic on the surface. It's dungeon crawling with fan service in it, but frankly it's really well put together and that's what makes it stand out above pretty much every other dungeon crawler that came out on Vita, which is basically like 90% experience titles, but whatever. The gameplay is really in-depth. You meet a lot of companions who each have classes that can each divide into subclasses, and the game's looting mechanics and general dungeon crawling go really well to giving it that 80-hour or so playtime that it's got behind it. Most of which is probably endgame, but I mean, there you go. It's also got some really interesting characters. They're all a bit airheaded, but the writing is really well put together. It was translated by Atlas, who did things like Persona, Utawara Ramono, and even Etrian Odyssey. So you would think they would know how to not only translate a good story, but make it work in the sense of a dungeon crawling sense. So it's basically just really well put together. It's the best dungeon crawler on Vita simply by just putting in the work and getting above the rest the hard way. So when you're talking about dungeon crawlers on the Vita, there's pretty much nowhere else you'd rather be. Number 19. Taiko no Tatsujin is a concept that has been refined over years and years and years of arcade releases, and this is absolutely one of the best iterations of it. You get a good bunch of songs, there's something like 70 plus, not to mention the DLC can very easily push that to 200, and the gameplay is very easy to get into. It's one lane, it's two different kinds of notes that you can hit in a couple of different ways, and the overwhelming speed and simplicity of it really forms together to make it an incredibly engaging rhythm game and my personal favorite on the Vita by far. Not to mention they've got a pretty good selection of stuff, everything from Vocaloid songs to game music to anime openings to, well, basically everything you can imagine that would be popular in Japanese weeb culture. So it is intensely satisfying to play a really hard song with a really hard pattern and just get it perfectly on point. The only real downside to this version is that you can't get a proper taiko drum like you can on the consoles, but I am absolutely fine with just playing it on the console itself, whether it be I use the face buttons and the shoulder buttons, or a combination of some directions on either face buttons and the D-pad, or even the touchscreen, which actually does work relatively decently. So either way, if you're looking for a very simple but otherwise incredibly complex rhythm game with a ton of really good Japanese songs, this is the place you want to go. It is the best rhythm game on Vita. Number 18. Now, I just want to say something here. I grew up as a big fan of Mario Kart. I started on Mario Kart 64, and there's only been like one or two entries later on that I haven't liked. And even with saying that, Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed beats out pretty much every other Mario Kart game, except for Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, and even then it gets really close. The driving is really satisfying, and the tracks are incredibly unique thanks to the fact that they tend to morph after every single lap, so that racing through them feels like a fresh experience for a lot longer than any other Mario Kart game that I can think of. The transforming is really well handled and gives me some nice flashbacks to when Diddy Kong Racing was a thing, and each one handles significantly differently and needs a bunch of different sort of strategies to go with. It's got the best single-player campaign I've played of any kart racing game, with plenty of different individual modes, plenty of different, goals to go for, and not to mention at the very top end of the difficulty spectrum, it is very, very hard to keep up, which means it's got plenty of longevity in it, even for people who don't usually play kart racing games online. And of course, it did have a good online mode, although nobody plays it anymore these days, which is an extreme shame, because if there's any game that deserves it, it's definitely this one. Still, all the single-player content can absolutely keep you going for a fair few hours, which is why I recommend this version intensely. The only real downside is that some of the other versions, like the PC version, are more up-to-date on DLC characters and tracks, but you still get a good smattering of both in this version. Number 17. This is absolutely a cheat. I do not care. This is my list. I can do it however I want, but I would have all of these games somewhere in the top 20 or the top 50, just somewhere in there, because it is almost impossible to leave all three of these out. They're all made by the same developer, which is Vanillaware. One is a Japanese-inspired action game, one is a Norse-inspired action game, and one is a Western mythology-inspired dungeon crawler, and they are all fantastic. They all have great combat. They all look incredible. Their art styles are just something to behold, especially on an OLED Vita screen. And the overall length of their gameplay, along with the variety, thanks to the fact they've all got a ridiculous amount of selectable characters, each that play very differently, makes them all intensely enjoyable action titles. And literally throw a dart. It doesn't matter. Pick one and go. You will have a fantastic time either way. Number 16. While Mobile Suit Gundam Extreme vs. Force doesn't carry the extreme amount of depth that the originals do, it does still carry the soul. You still have plenty of individual robots, each of which are intensely fun to pilot and fight. You still have many of the techniques that made the series popular, and you've still got a ton of single-player content to do, including a multiple-hour length campaign and plenty of arcade stages that will teach you whether or not you are ready. Spoiler alert, you probably aren't. The game itself is still intensely fun to play, runs really well, has an immense amount of challenge, and is very capable of getting you into the absolute gloriousness that is either Gundam Versus or Gundam Extreme Versus in the arcade. The only real downside is a lack of proper multiplayer mode, but to be fair, the other games are better at that anyway, and it is highly recommended that you go and play them if you want the real multiplayer experience. For single-player experiences, though, this is absolutely great, and I still keep it around on my Vita to do a couple of arcade stages from time to time. I wholeheartedly recommend it if Gundam or high-speed robot action or even anything remotely close to that appeals to you, because honestly, it is awesome. Number 15. Steins Gate suffers from the one problem that all these visual novels have, in which that it starts out, the first half at least, being a bunch of weirdos meeting up, being weirdos together, and being absolutely lovable in the process. I personally found myself quite enjoying it, but if you manage to get through that, you get a time travel story of ridiculous scale, you get a bunch of really lovable characters having terrible things happen to them and growing up a lot in the process, and you get a guy who thinks he can handle being hunted down by an organization that's hidden in the shadows, getting exactly what he asked for, and regretting it very heavily in the process. It's an incredibly enjoyable ride, and I loved every minute of it once I got to the very end of it. The only downsides is that, again, that pacing thing, and pretty much everything else that has come out since that's Steins Gate related somehow doesn't manage to come even close to the original formula. At least I can say you don't have to worry about the sequel not being available on the same platform, huh? At the end of the day, out of the 5 or 6 franchises that are clawing for the top visual novel podium position on Vita, Steins Gate still manages to hang on quite well, at least in my personal point of view. Some other people are going to say it's the best thing on Vita, and I'm not going to argue with their personal tastes, because frankly the game is so good that I can see why it would be number 1 in a lot of people's positions, and that pretty much applies to every other series that didn't take the number 1 spot, but oh well, it is still absolutely a fantastic ride and well worth recommending if you're even a remote fan of science fiction. Number 14. Came completely by surprise to me. I wasn't expecting it to be even remotely good. It's got so much going against it. It came out like 10 years ago, as of this recording, in the United States, and flopped so hard that it just disappeared and never showed its face again. It is made by Konami, who have basically gone straight down the drain recently in the form of worthwhile games. And it is a baseball game. It is a sports game. So how could all 3 of these combine into something that I would find even remotely enjoyable? Well, here's the thing. It is incredibly in-depth. It's got tons of little ways to configure players. It's got its own little system for making them, which just really appeals to me in the form of these little traits that you give individual players that give them their own individuality. It's got tons of modes to play through. You can create players in some modes and transfer them into other modes. And some of the modes that it comes up with are really clever ideas for games, including the whole Power Pro Festival mode they introduced in 2016, which got a big overhaul in 2018, which makes this version the one to recommend. Not to mention all the other stuff it's got. Like, it's got all the official Japanese baseball teams with an impressive amount of detail. It's got tons of individual stats for each of them. It's got the ability to do things like make your own pitches, make your own cheering songs. It's got tons of options to customize the way you can play. You've got the ability to grab players from online and share your own players online. And the actual gameplay itself is this really well done blend of arcade and simulation that doesn't stray too far into either side of the field, and it works really well and is intensely satisfying to get a home run with. It's one of the best sports games I've ever played, and I can't even understand a word of it. If that doesn't give you an idea of just how good this series is, then please, go and play it yourself. I wasn't even a fan of baseball when I played this, and I still absolutely love this title. Number 13. Earth Defense Force 2 is an incredibly simple concept. It's Starship Troopers with a lighter tone and a bit of Japanese humor thrown on top. You drop in, you have your 2 weapons, or in the Air Raiders case, your 3, and you shoot all the bugs. That's all you do. You upgrade your weapons and your dude's health over time, and you just continue shooting the bugs. Shoot the bugs, shoot the bugs, shoot the bugs. In comparison to a lot of games these days where they have a ton of like over-the-top extra systems that you need to deal with, going and playing something this simple and this straightforward can be incredibly satisfying, and it's clearly shown that it works with the overall popularity of the series skyrocketing recently with the performance of Earth Defense Force 4.1 and 5. And this version in particular beats the other game on Vita, Earth Defense Force 2017, because it has more missions, more guns, and an extra class in the form of the Air Raider, but he's actually pretty usable on the ground by himself. Some people complain that games where you turn your brain off and just shoot things mindlessly are bad just on the premise of it, but this game in particular has the right balance of campiness, seriousness, and just overall solid gameplay that it all works together spectacularly. Not to mention that this is the Vita version of Earth Defense Force 2, so it runs absolutely perfectly, and having just a gigantic wave of ants come at you and have it not drop a frame is one of the coolest things to be able to do, something you can barely even do with the PS4 version of like Earth Defense Force 5, so it is an absolutely fantastic game to just sit down and blow the absolute bejesus out of a giant ant with. Number 12. Metal Gear Solid 3 is one of the best games ever made, and Metal Gear Solid 3 HD Edition on Vita is one of the best ports of the game ever made. Let's just talk about the port first. It runs really well, the gameplay itself is buttery smooth, and it's only let down by the fact that the cutscenes are at half the frame rate they're supposed to be. The game is presented fantastically on Vita, it looks wonderful, it honestly is one of the best looking games on the system because they did such a good job of converting it from the PlayStation 2 original, and it is really tiny as well. It is like 2 gigabytes. It can fit on most memory cards, which is a reason why I try and keep it around as much as humanly possible, because outside of like 1 or 2 things they took out of it, they managed to keep the entirety of things like codec conversations, gameplay staples, and just general things about it that make it one of the best ports imaginable. This isn't even beginning to mention Metal Gear Solid 2, which again is a very, very good game, but at the same time it's not my favorite of the series. However, I will say that the Metal Gear Solid HD collection is probably still one of the best bundles ever because, well, frankly, it's worth paying almost anything for a good copy of Metal Gear Solid 3, and you get Metal Gear Solid 2 as a bonus, so why not? And I just want to point out that I haven't even talked about Metal Gear Solid 3 as an actual game yet, to which I will say is one of the best stealth games ever made. Its sandbox is incredibly diverse, you have a ton of options to get through anything in the game. There are a ridiculous amount of secrets, Easter eggs, and just enjoyable little things to find off to the side, which give it an immeasurable amount of depth, even compared to a lot of modern day games. And it is just a great experience story-wise from beginning to end, and some of the characters are some of the most enjoyable they've ever been in this entire series. It is absolutely a game that's worth playing, even if you've never played Metal Gear Solid before, because of the fact that it is a prequel with pretty much no ties to the rest of the series. A 100% recommendation. Number 11. It's a little hard to pick one game over the other in this case. They are both incredibly solid action RPGs, but East Memories of Celceta has a much faster pace, simplified gameplay loop, and is just generally a lot more immediate and in the action. Not to mention the overall quality of the translation is way ahead of Ys 8 for multiple reasons. Ys 8 has the gameplay become a lot more complex, there are a lot more things to do, and of course the entire thing goes a more full form of 3D, so it's a lot easier to explore, and the translation, while still being a lot better than it was before since its overhaul, is still a little bit wanting at the end of the day. But outside of all of that, these are both still fantastic examples of action RPGs. They both run really well for the Vita's spec set, and they both have absolutely amazing soundtracks because these guys are just intensely good at doing that sort of thing. So they are the quintessential action RPGs that aren't monster hunting games or just your general one versus many brawlers, and trust me, there's a couple of them coming up soon. No matter which one you pick though, at the end of the day, they are still perfectly great RPGs in and of themselves, and each will give you great stories, great characters, and a good amount of action fun. Alright, I'm gonna be honest, I've tried recording this extra segment 3 times, but I just can't seem to come off as anything other than irrationally whiny, but if I'm being honest, I made that title I made the declaration that this extra segment was going to be replacing the Vita with the Switch, but for the life of me, it just didn't happen. And I tried. I legitimately really tried. And chances are, eventually, when like the Switch Lite goes on a discount or something, I might end up trying again. But for the life of me, the Switch just doesn't have what made the Vita special, and I'm not entirely sure what it is, which is why I'd like to try and discuss that, but again, if I come off sounding as whiny in this particular segment, I'm sorry about that, but there just doesn't seem to be a way around it for me this time. So there are a couple of reasons why the Switch just hasn't done very well for me. One might be just my regular Switch ended up having a bit of a problem. I bought my Switch day one, along with a couple of games, you know, I actually tried and made some use out of it, but for the life of me, I just had a few problems that I just haven't been able to work around. The first is that my Switch heats up a little bit more and bends a little bit more than some other people's do, although I remember that being a problem around launch. And I ended up having a problem with my right Joy-Con where it broke almost immediately, And for some reason, whenever I'm playing a game in portable mode, it means that I'm trying to, every 20 or 30 minutes, having to pull it out and put the Joy-Con back in because the Switch just loses detection of it for some reason. And for the life of me, I just can't figure out what's causing that problem or find another way to make it work. So for whatever reason, I've just been kind of reduced to using it as a sort of TV-based console because mine just seems to be broken. And I don't have another $120 to go and spend on a bunch of Joy-Cons because Nintendo taxes real people to figure out if the Joy-Cons themselves are the problem. So, I don't know. Maybe you can buy individual Joy-Cons now. I haven't actually looked, but yeah, it's still relatively expensive either way probably because again, it's Nintendo. And there's another problem with the Switch, it's got the Nintendo tax, where games are incredibly expensive, and trying to get all the games that I want to put some time into for the Switch, in terms of like for videos or whether or not I'm just interested in them, seems to be a real problem for my wallet, because for some reason, every single bloody game that releases on the Nintendo Switch is more expensive than it should be. Even for games that come out cheaper on other platforms, they seem to get the bloody Nintendo tax applied. And it doesn't really help when it turns out that some of these games are actually way worse than they are on other platforms, whether it be due to technical reasons or it's just like it plays better on PC for another platform for one reason or another. It also doesn't seem to have picked up everything along the lines of games that I like, despite the fact that it seems to be a fair bit more open to like the well, I say the ecchi side of things, but you know what I'm talking about. Japan's side of games that tend to appeal more to the bouncy, jiggly, and otherwise very enjoyable side of things don't seem to have made as much of a splash on the Switch. In fact, not much of anything I do like seems to have made much of a splash on the Switch. It seems to be overloaded with things like indie ports that came out a few years ago on other consoles, ports of other games that came out relatively more recently but otherwise are still ports on other consoles, or just your general Nintendo titles, which I said before that it felt like Nintendo was getting their groove back, i.e. games along the lines of Super Mario Odyssey and Xenoblade Chronicles 2, but a couple of other games that have come out recently, like Daemon X Machina, which they put a fair bit of attention behind, and God, what was the other one? I don't know, but there are a couple of games that just seem to have been, like, losing their touch recently. There are a couple of weird ones that come out of nowhere from time to time, like Fishing Spirits, for example, but finding truly interesting games like that has become a struggle and a half just because there's like 15 or 20 releases for the Switch every damn week. I have to search through all the individual stores, and even then, finding the interesting things in between ports of games that already came out years ago on other systems, or just general, like, crappy indie games that no one else would give the time of day if they weren't on Switch, is becoming really, really hard. Like, finding Fishing Spirits was a random stroke of luck on PlayAsia's pre-order section. I didn't even know what it was. I had to go look it up after I found it on there, so finding stuff that's interesting is just getting harder and harder with the consistent release schedule on the Switch, and I fear it's actually going to do a fair bit of damage to the overall longevity of the system just because there's so much crap on it that people are going to find themselves not buying anything just because they can't find any of the really interesting stuff without a bunch of warnings from people who review literally everything on the system first. With all of that said, though, there are just things on Switch that have come out that I haven't found any particular enjoyment for. I haven't really been able to pick up my Switch and play it anywhere near as much as anything else. All the games I've picked up on it just haven't been able to keep my attention for very long for one reason or another, and that is really disappointing to me. Like, I bought Sengoku Rants very recently, and that's been keeping my attention a lot more on the PC than any of the games I picked up on Switch have, which is really disappointing. And I've actively been trying. Like, I bought like 4 games on Switch very recently. I've been waiting for them all to come out, and they were Astral Chain, Demon Cross Machina, Ghostbusters, which will have been out and released and ready to go beforehand, and there was another one which I can't remember the exact title of, not to mention all the other games I've bought in the past, and none of them can keep my attention the same way a bunch of the games I've listed so far on this list have. And I don't know if it's the games that are coming out or if it's me, because I like to think I have decent taste, but for the life of me, I just haven't been able to enjoy games anywhere near as much on the Switch as I have on other platforms. And you know where I have been able to enjoy games on more than I have on the Switch? The GBD Win 2. That's been doing a way better job at replacing the Vita for me in comparison to the Switch, where there are interesting games coming out constantly, and thankfully the Steam platform, not to mention a couple of other things, have been managing to keep up with it in keeping up with the ridiculous release line of games in comparison to Switch, which seems to be just toss it out there and let the market sort it out. And there seems to be just way better game libraries on the GBD Win 2, because there is everything from really obscure visual novels like Wagamama High Spec to even some of the more recently released games like Blade Destiny 2 works on the GBD Win 2 to my surprise, with all the settings turned down and all that. Although I can't stand to play that game for more than an hour, I'm just making a point here. There are a couple of games that do work better on the GBD Win 2 than they do on the Switch, and that's where they end up being played. Like, I play the Binding of Isaac Afterbirth on GBD Win 2 way better than I do on Switch, just because on GBD Win 2 the performance is better. And again, buying games that have the Nintendo tax put on them, and you don't know whether or not they're going to turn out better or worse than the GBD Win 2 without spending the money, is just something that really frustrates me at the end of the day. And that's why the GBD Win 2 has just been doing better, because it seems to have better curation, it has a better library, just overall on a wider scale. It's way better to play visual novels on the GBD Win 2 for a fair few reasons, and it's easier for me to carry around as well. Even with popping the Joy-Cons off, I still have trouble fitting the Switch and the Joy-Cons in separate pockets, and I'm a big dude. I've got big pockets, and I still have trouble carrying this thing around. I've noticed that some of these things are probably going to be resolved with the Switch Lite, but things like the fact that they're using the same analog sticks, which means they're going to be a lot more wary to drift than my Vita ever was, and considering that I had to send back both of my Vitas at least once to fix acting up joysticks, was something that was really frustrating at the end of the day for me, and considering the fact that they're not going off that more faulty joystick design for the Switch Lite, means that I don't see any reason for me to pick one up, because knowing my luck, I'll probably break it within 6 months. So, yeah, admittedly, I have been using my GBD Win 2 as a replacement for my Vita a lot more, as I've been finishing up games on my Vita and moving to other platforms. It just seems to be the place for me personally. So, yeah, if you also, for whatever reason, GameCube emulation works fine on the GBD Win 2 and they won't even touch a Nintendo 64 on the Switch for whatever reason they desire with that. So, yeah, I'm not going to claim to know what's going on there. Maybe they'll do that in the future and all the points I've made here will be naught, but I've been enjoying the GBD Win 2 way more than I have the Switch. It's simply that simple. I've been playing games that I never thought I'd even touch on GBD Win 2, and on Switch it just seems to be the same thing, different day for half of the games that show up on that game's new release list. So, yeah, it just seems like that the overall combination of an interesting amount of niche titles, just small enough to be portable, but while still having decent enough specs and general good controls and all of that. It's just this weird little combination of things going on that make the Vita unique that even the GBD Win 2 admittedly doesn't really live up to at the end of the day. So, who knows? Maybe the Vita is just that irreplaceable. Alright, I've got 10 more to do. I'll see you all next time.